On New Year's morning, a tired Latina waitress knelt at the curb and offered a warm plate to a homeless man everyone ignored, never knowing he carried a secret that could ruin a billionaire. The quiet suburban street barely breathed, still heavy with last night's fireworks and glitter, while pale winter light softened every house into a false kind of peace. Marisol Vega thought it would be just another exhausted act of routine kindness before she finally slept, until the man's hands shook and his eyes flashed with panic, as if compassion had suddenly become dangerous. What she did next wasn't about charity or attention, it was about dignity. She had no idea that this small choice, made on a morning most people would forget, would become the moment that dragged a hidden truth into the open. Her red diner uniform was creased from the late shift, and her sneakers were damp from dew clinging to the sidewalk. Eddie sat low on the curb with his back against a mailbox post, bundled in worn layers and quiet shame, as if he'd learned to fold himself into the edges of the world. Marisol held the plate with both hands, careful not to tilt it, feeling warmth rise from it like a stubborn little hearth in the cold air. "Easy," she murmured, not like a rescuer, but like a daughter speaking softly to someone's father, mindful of the pride that kept him upright. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to steam, silence, and the fragile grace of being seen. Eddie didn't reach for the food. Instead, he lifted his palm over it, trembling, protective, like he expected someone to snatch the plate away and punish him for accepting it. Marisol's smile faltered as she followed his gaze down the street, where the morning should have been empty and harmless. A black luxury SUV rolled in without urgency, the kind of vehicle that didn't need to hurry because the world always made room for it. It glided to the curb, as if it owned not just the street, but the right to decide what goodness was allowed to exist. Two security men stepped out first, moving with the clean precision of people trained to create distance without ever raising their voices. Then a tall man in a tailored suit emerged, smooth hair, controlled expression, the kind of face magazines love to frame with words like genius and visionary. He walked toward them as if approaching a private appointment, not a sidewalk, and the gleam of his cufflinks caught the weak sun like small cold moons. When he raised his hand, it wasn't a greeting, it was a command. Marisol felt heat flood her cheeks, a sudden shame that made her wonder if she'd been caught doing something wrong, even though all she held was a plate of food. Across the street, a Happy New Year banner drooped from a porch, blinking faintly above an American flag that stirred in the breeze. Behind living room windows, curtains barely shifted, the neighborhood watching without admitting it, letting power do the speaking so they wouldn't have to. The suited man's voice came measured and polite, in the way power could be polite, while still cutting. And his eyes slid past Marisol as if she were part of the background. Eddie's shoulders tightened, and in that tightness Marisol understood this wasn't random, and it wasn't about safety or rules. The billionaire hadn't come to help. He had come to interrupt, because Eddie was not a stranger at all. The billionaire's raised palm stayed in the air a moment too long, as if he could freeze the morning by sheer authority. Marisol kept kneeling, but her knees no longer felt like they belonged to her. The plate's warmth faded against the cold bite of the curb, and even the steam seemed to hesitate. Eddie's eyes never settled, darting from the SUV to the sidewalks, measuring exits like a man counting heartbeats. In that stillness, Marisol realized fear could be louder than shouting. The neighborhood was quiet in a New Year kind of way. No lawnmowers, no kids, only distant wind and the faint crackle of leftover decorations. A string of porch lights blinked lazily, pretending celebration where there was only sleep. Somewhere, a television murmured behind a wall, muffled like a dream no one remembered. Marisol could feel curtains watching, not with curiosity but with caution, the kind that protects comfort at any cost. She wanted to stand and speak, yet her throat tightened as if the air itself had turned heavy. Graham Harlan's voice was calm, almost courteous, and that was what made it frightening. He spoke in smooth sentences that sounded reasonable until you noticed they left no room for disagreement. "This isn't your responsibility," he said, as though responsibility belonged only to the powerful. One of the security men glanced at Marisol's apron logo again, the look brief but precise, like a note being filed away. Marisol's stomach twisted because she understood that being seen could become a kind of vulnerability. Eddie's hand still hovered over the food, not reaching, not taking, just guarding the moment like it might shatter. His face held an exhausted apology, as if he hated what his presence was doing to her life. "Go," he whispered, barely moving his lips, and the word carried more history than Marisol could guess. She wanted to tell him she wasn't afraid, but her body betrayed her with a tremor she couldn't hide. In his eyes, she saw the warning of someone who had survived by trusting no one, not even kindness. Marisol finally found her voice, soft at first, then steadier, like a candle refusing to go out. "He's hungry," she said, and it sounded so simple it should have ended everything. Graham's expression didn't change much, only a subtle tightening around the eyes, as if patience had limits and she was discovering them. Eddie's shoulders curled inward, bracing for a blow that might not be physical, and as the quiet street held its breath, Marisol sensed the truth settling in. Eddie wasn't scared of the cold, or the neighbors, or even the police. He was scared of what Graham already knew. Marisol Vega lived by the clock, the kind that kept moving no matter how tired her bones felt. Her mornings began before sunrise, hair tied back, apron strings pulled tight, stepping into the diner as if routine itself could keep life from slipping. The place smelled of coffee and butter and fried potatoes, a warmth that made strangers feel safe for an hour. People called her sweetheart and honey, the way they did with service workers, never asking what it cost her to keep smiling. She didn't crave luxury, only steadiness, the quiet kind that let you breathe without flinching. Her mother called every day from a small apartment across town, her prayers traveling through the phone line like soft hands on Marisol's shoulders. "Be kind," she would say, "but don't let kindness make you disappear," as if gentleness and strength were supposed to live in the same chest. Marisol kept a notebook of tips and bills, columns of numbers, written with the careful discipline of someone building a future one shift at a time. If the dishwasher looked worn down, she slipped him an extra few dollars without announcing it, because she believed good things should stay humble. In Marisol's world, the best people weren't the loudest. They were the ones who did the right thing when nobody was clapping. Eddie entered her life on a night when rain blurred the parking lot lights, and the dumpsters smelled sharper than usual. She stepped out after closing and saw him sitting near the curb, shoulders bowed, shaking as if the cold had reached inside his bones. She went back in, packed leftovers in a takeout box, and returned with a quiet, awkward offering that felt too small for the need she saw. He didn't beg or perform gratitude, he just nodded, eyes lowered, accepting as if kindness might be something that could get him in trouble. A week later she brought a blanket, and then another meal, and then the habit became a promise she never spoke out loud. For months it stayed simple on the surface: food, a few words, a nod, a soft "God bless you" that Eddie rarely returned. But Marisol noticed strange details that didn't fit the story people assumed about him. He watched cars the way some people watched weather, tracking patterns, listening for danger in engines. He asked about the news, about business headlines, about names that didn't belong in the mouth of someone sleeping on concrete. Once she glimpsed a faded hospital band tucked in his sleeve, half hidden, like a bruise he didn't want to explain. Another time, he flinched at a camera flash from a neighbor's holiday photo, as if even light could expose him. The day before New Year's Eve, Eddie's voice turned thin and urgent, and his eyes looked older than his face. "If they find me," he whispered, You'll pay for feeding me." And the words landed in Marisol's chest like cold stones. She forced a laugh, trying to break the tension, but her hands shook around her keys as she walked back into the diner. That night, as she stepped out into the parking lot, she saw a black SUV idling across the street with its headlights dimmed, waiting like a thought you couldn't shake. And when she reached her car, she found a plain white note tucked under her windshield wiper, 5 words that made her knees go weak because they didn't feel like a prank. They felt like a promise. "We know your name, Marisol." Back on the curb, Graham Harlan spoke as if he were stepping into a boardroom instead of a winter morning, his suit too perfect for the cracked sidewalk beneath his shoes. He looked at Marisol with the calm attention of someone cataloguing details, then glanced at Eddie like a problem already labeled and filed away. "You shouldn't be involved," he said, his voice smooth enough to sound like advice, sharp enough to feel like a boundary. One of the security men shifted closer, not touching, not threatening outright, just close enough to change the air. Marisol's fingers tightened around the edge of the empty space where the plate had been, as if holding on to her right to choose. Graham asked her name, and when she answered, he repeated it carefully, like he wanted her to hear it in his mouth. "Marisol," he said, and it felt wrong, too familiar, too controlled, like someone reading the label on a door before deciding whether to knock or break it down. He nodded once toward her diner apron, the logo bright against the faded red fabric, and Marisol understood he wasn't only seeing her, he was placing her in a system he could reach. Eddie's shoulders curled inward, eyes fixed on the pavement, as if looking up would trigger something worse. The neighborhood stayed quiet, and that silence suddenly felt like permission. "I can take it from here," Graham continued, and the words carried the weight of entitlement dressed as responsibility. He didn't ask what Eddie needed, or what Marisol had been doing for weeks, or whether anyone had hurt him. He spoke the way powerful people spoke when they meant, "This belongs to me now." Marisol felt anger rise slowly, not loud and wild but steady, the kind that comes when you realize someone is trying to make your compassion feel like a mistake. Eddie's hand lifted again, half warning, half surrender, like he was begging her not to provoke the storm. But Marisol had already seen the fear in him, and it made her stubborn. Graham's security team stood in a neat formation behind him, a polished wall that didn't need to shout to feel dangerous. Marisol noticed the smallest details, the glint of cufflinks, the expensive watch, the way Graham's posture never softened, even when his voice did. Above them, a drooping "Happy New Year" banner blinked faintly, its cheerful lights out of place against the cold tension on the sidewalk. She thought of the diner's warm windows, of coffee refills and small talk, and how different this was. How this felt like stepping into someone else's rules. Graham's gaze didn't leave her face now, and she sensed he had decided she mattered in the worst way. "Step away," he said at last, still polite, still composed, as if offering her the chance to be smart. "Let professionals handle the situation." The word professionals made Eddie flinch, like it carried an old wound, and that flinch did something to Marisol. It snapped her doubt into certainty. If she obeyed, she might keep her job, keep her peace, keep herself out of danger. If she refused, she would be standing in the path of a man who looked like he had never been told no in his life. And Eddie's fear said that no could cost more than pride. And in that thin winter air, with power hovering inches away, Marisol realized she was holding a choice that might change everything, because walking away would be easy, but living with it would not. Graham's expression stayed calm, but his words began to tighten like a collar you didn't notice until you tried to breathe. "You have a good heart," he said, as if complimenting her was the same as owning the narrative, "but you don't understand what you're getting involved with." One of the security men shifted again, and Marisol felt the subtle pressure of bodies trained to move people without ever laying a hand on them. Eddie's eyes flicked to Marisol's apron, then to the street, then down again, as though every detail could become evidence. The morning air was still, but the moment felt crowded with invisible threats. Marisol swallowed, trying to steady her voice the way she steadied plates when the diner got busy. "He's a person," she said, and it sounded small against the polished certainty in Graham's tone. Graham nodded slightly, like he had heard her, like he respected her, yet nothing about his posture moved an inch toward compassion. "Of course," he replied, "and that's exactly why you should step back." The way he said step back made it feel less like a suggestion and more like a rule that existed before she arrived. Eddie's hand hovered near his chest, not pleading, not reaching, just bracing. Then the threat arrived, dressed in reason. Graham's eyes drifted to the quiet houses, the curb, the street sign, as if mapping jurisdiction. "This neighborhood has concerns," he said, smooth and patient, "and people can misunderstand situations like this." Marisol felt heat creep up her neck, that old familiar shame that came when others treated her kindness like something improper. One security guard's gaze fell on her diner logo again, lingering a fraction longer, as if memorizing it. It wasn't a glare, not even unfriendly. It was administrative, and that was what made it colder. Marisol thought of her manager who counted every minute, her paycheck that barely held her life together, her mother's voice warning her not to disappear. She pictured a police officer walking into the diner, asking questions, making her co-workers whisper, making customers stare. Graham didn't have to say those things aloud. He only had to place them in the air like a match near dry paper. Eddie's shoulders slumped, and in his silence, Marisol heard a message louder than any speech. This man has done this before, and he knows how it ends. A child's balloon, left from last night, bobbed weakly from a mailbox down the street, its bright color absurd against the heaviness forming at their feet. Marisol lifted her chin anyway, because she could feel the moment trying to shrink her. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, each word chosen carefully, like stepping stones over ice. Graham's mouth softened into something that looked almost sympathetic, until his eyes sharpened by half an inch. "Wrong is a matter of perspective," he replied quietly, and Marisol understood the first real wound wasn't fear of his strength. It was the realization that he could twist the truth until her kindness looked like a crime. And as Eddie's gaze begged her to stop talking, Marisol sensed she had already been marked, not by what she did, but by who had noticed. Eddie tried to stand, and it looked like it cost him more than muscle and balance. It cost him whatever peace he had left. His knees shook, his breath caught, but his spine straightened with stubborn dignity, the kind that refuses to be pitied even when it's hurting. "I don't need anything from you," he said, voice rough, aimed at Graham like a shield made of pride. The words weren't loud, yet they carried a history of being cornered, bought, and threatened. Marisol felt her heart tighten because she could tell Eddie wasn't just refusing help, he was refusing ownership. Graham's face didn't flash anger, it stayed controlled, almost gentle, which made it worse. "This isn't about help," he replied, and the calmness in his tone sounded practiced, like he had said it many times in rooms where people nodded and obeyed. "It's a private matter." The phrase dropped between them like a locked door. Eddie's jaw clenched, and Marisol saw the flicker of something deep. Shame, maybe, or grief, before he forced it back down. Whatever private meant, it wasn't safe. Without thinking, Marisol moved. She didn't step forward like someone looking for a fight. She stepped forward like someone placing herself between a flame and a curtain. Her body acted before her fear could argue, and suddenly she was standing half in front of Eddie, palms open, shoulders squared. She heard her mother's voice in her head, steady as a prayer. "Dignity is the first meal." Graham's gaze settled on her fully now, no longer sliding past her, no longer dismissing her as background. In that stare, Marisol felt the shift from inconvenience to obstacle. One of the security men took a small step, not close enough to touch, but close enough to remind her they could. The quiet street pressed in with its polite indifference, curtains still, porches still, as if the neighborhood had decided to let power handle the mess so no one's comfort got disturbed. Eddie's hand gripped the edge of the mailbox post, knuckles pale, and Marisol could feel him trembling behind her. It wasn't only weakness. There was recognition, the way a body recognizes a danger it survived once. Graham's cufflinks caught the light again, and Marisol hated how something so small could look like a warning. "Marisol," Graham said, using her name like he'd earned it, "you're a good person. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The words sounded almost kind, but the message underneath was clear. I can make your life difficult. Eddie leaned in a fraction, his voice barely a thread. "Please," he whispered, and it wasn't a plea for food anymore. It was a plea for her to understand what she was standing in front of. He said her name the way someone says a prayer when the room is already filling with smoke, and Marisol realized her courage had crossed a line she couldn't see, only feel. It happened in a blink, one sharp movement, one step too close, one breath that turned into panic. Eddie flinched hard, not like a man startled by a stranger, but like someone hearing an old nightmare call his name. Marisol's hands tightened around the plate, instinctively pulling it closer, as if she could protect the moment itself. But her fingers were tired from the long shift, numb from the cold, and trembling from the pressure that Graham's presence poured into the air. The plate slipped. It hit the curb with a crack that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet street. Ceramic shattered, and the warm food spilled across the cold pavement like wasted comfort, steam rising for a second before the winter swallowed it. Marisol's stomach dropped, as if something inside her had broken too, because she hadn't just dropped a meal. She had dropped a promise. Eddie's eyes widened, fixed on the mess, as if it were evidence in a courtroom. For a heartbeat, nobody moved, and the silence felt cruel. Then the security men closed in, not rushing, not grabbing, just tightening the circle, making the sidewalk smaller. Eddie recoiled, shoulders curling, hands lifting defensively, and Marisol saw it clearly now. He wasn't afraid of hunger. He was afraid of being taken. Graham didn't raise his voice, didn't even step back from the spill. He simply watched, calm and certain, as though chaos always arranged itself around him. "See," he said softly, as if the broken plate proved his point. "This is exactly why you shouldn't be involved." A slow rumble approached from the cross street, and Marisol turned her head just as a police cruiser rounded the corner. It moved at that careful, curious speed. No sirens, no urgency, drawn less by the broken plate than by the luxury SUV that didn't belong in a sleepy neighborhood at dawn. The officer's eyes landed on the SUV first, then on Graham, then on the security men, and Marisol felt the sick certainty of how this story would be told. Graham's posture shifted into effortless familiarity, the way powerful men looked when they expected to be understood. Eddie swallowed hard, and Marisol could see him measuring the distance to run, even though his legs barely held him upright. Graham stepped toward the cruiser before Marisol could say a word, lifting a hand in a calm greeting that looked almost friendly from a distance. He leaned in and spoke quietly to the officer, his voice too low for Marisol to hear, but his confidence loud enough to translate without sound. The officer nodded once, then glanced at Marisol's wrinkled uniform, at the diner logo on her apron, and finally at Eddie, still flinching, still bracing, still trying to be small. Marisol opened her mouth to explain, to tell the truth before it got rewritten, but the officer raised his own hand, mirroring Graham's earlier gesture. "Ma'am," the officer said, his tone firm in that practiced way that left no space for argument, "step away from him." That night, Marisol sat on the edge of her bed with her diner shoes still on, as if unlacing them would make the day permanent. The room was small and dim, lit by a single lamp that turned the corners into soft shadows. Her hands rested in her lap, but they wouldn't stop trembling, the way they had trembled on the curb when power stepped too close. Outside, someone down the block laughed too loudly, celebrating a new year that felt like it belonged to other people. Marisol tried to breathe slowly, yet every breath seemed to catch on something heavy inside her chest. She replayed the morning in relentless fragments. Graham's cold palm raised like a command, the security men tightening their quiet circle, Eddie's eyes pleading without words. The crack of the plate breaking came back the clearest, a sharp sound that made her flinch even in silence. Then the officer's voice returned, firm, practiced, unquestioning, telling her to step away, as if kindness were a suspicious act. What haunted her most was how quickly the street surrendered to that version of the story, how easily the truth bent toward money. She had walked away, but it felt less like leaving and more like being pushed. At the diner, she had scrubbed the stain from her apron and lied when her manager asked why she looked pale. The lie tasted like burnt coffee, bitter and familiar, and it terrified her how naturally it came. Marisol imagined Graham calling the diner, imagined questions asked with polite smiles, imagined her job slipping away because someone important decided she was inconvenient. She thought of her mother's voice saying, "Don't let the world make you small," and wondered when exactly she had started shrinking without noticing. The worst part was realizing that hard work didn't protect you from power, it only made you easier to overlook. She walked to the small church a few blocks away, the one that stayed open for early prayers and late regrets. Inside, the air smelled like wax and old wood, and the quiet felt different. Less judgment, more listening. She lit a candle with shaking fingers and watched the flame steady itself, small but stubborn, against the dark. "I don't want revenge," she whispered, barely louder than her breath. "I just want to know what's true." And in the gentle tremble of that light, her fear began to shift into something firmer, something that sounded like resolve. When she stepped back outside, the cold sharpened her cheeks, but her mind felt clearer than it had all day. Eddie had warned her, and the billionaire's arrival had proven the warning wasn't paranoia. It was history repeating itself. Marisol understood that silence might protect her comfort, but it would leave Eddie alone in the shadow of someone who could erase him with a phone call. She didn't know what Eddie had done, or what he knew, or why Graham's calm looked more like fear than confidence. She only knew that if she stayed quiet now, the secret would survive, and the people guarding it would learn they could silence her too. Marisol expected the diner to feel different the next morning, like the world had shifted and everyone could see it on her face. The fluorescent light still buzzed, the coffee still brewed, and the bell above the door still chimed like nothing had happened. But Marisol moved through her shift with a tightness in her chest, waiting for a whisper, a glance, a question that would turn her into a story. Every time the front door opened, she half expected to see a uniform or a suit, or that black SUV sliding into the parking lot. She kept refilling cups with hands that were steadier than her thoughts. During the slow stretch between breakfast and lunch, Mrs. Donnelly, older, sharp-eyed and quietly protective, called Marisol into the back near the storage shelves. Her voice stayed gentle, but her gaze didn't waver. "I saw it," she said, and Marisol's stomach dropped, bracing for judgment. Instead, Mrs. Donnelly pulled out an old phone with a cracked screen and tapped it twice, showing a shaky video from the diner window. The footage wasn't perfect, but it captured the SUV, the suited man's raised palm, and the way Eddie flinched like he'd been hunted before. Marisol stared at the screen and felt something loosen in her chest, because for the first time since New Year's morning, the truth had weight. "You're not crazy," Mrs. Donnelly added, as if she could hear the doubts Marisol had been swallowing all night. She told Marisol she'd lived long enough to know when a situation was being controlled, and she had learned the hard way that goodness without proof was easy to twist into guilt. A retired mailman at the counter, overhearing only fragments, leaned closer and said he'd seen the homeless man before, years ago, near the old Harlan property on the edge of town. The name hit Marisol like a cold splash, connecting too neatly with the note under her windshield and Graham's certainty on the curb. Eddie wasn't just drifting through the neighborhood. He had a history that reached into places money tried to keep private. Marisol felt fear, but it no longer sat in her like a stone. It moved, turning into purpose. If Eddie was running, she needed to find him before Graham did, and she needed to understand what Eddie knew before it got buried. Mrs. Donnelly offered more than sympathy. She offered a ride after closing, an extra warm coat from her trunk, and the kind of loyalty that didn't ask for permission. "We don't leave people behind," she said simply, like it was an old rule carved into her bones. Marisol's eyes burned, not from sadness, but from the shock of being supported when she'd felt so alone. When Marisol clocked out, the sky had already begun to dim, turning the streets into long blue shadows. She tucked Mrs. Donnelly's phone video into her mind like a lifeline and pulled the borrowed coat tight around her shoulders. Somewhere out there, Eddie was hiding, tired, frightened, and convinced that anyone near him would get hurt. Marisol looked down the road and realized she wasn't chasing trouble. She was chasing truth, the kind that kept people from being erased, and as she climbed into Mrs. Donnelly's car, she understood one thing with quiet certainty. Tonight they would find Eddie, because if Graham found him first, there might be nothing left to save. They started with the places kindness collected: shelters, soup kitchens, church basements, where folding chairs scraped the floor, and coffee was always a little too weak. Marisol walked beside Mrs. Donnelly with her shoulders tight inside the borrowed coat, scanning faces, listening for the soft rhythm of Eddie's voice. The city looked different at dusk, colder and more honest, as if daylight had been a kind of mercy. At each stop, Marisol asked carefully, not wanting to turn Eddie into a rumor. Most people shook their heads, but a few hesitated in a way that felt like memory. At the second shelter, a volunteer with tired eyes recognized the description and frowned, as if he just remembered something he wished he hadn't. "He came in last week," the man said, lowering his voice, "but he didn't stay." He mentioned Eddie carried a hospital discharge paper folded small in his pocket, the kind people keep when they don't have anything else to prove they mattered. The volunteer said he'd seen the name on it by accident. Another last name, not Eddie's, before Eddie snatched it away like it could burn him. Marisol felt her skin prickle, the pieces clicking into place with an uncomfortable neatness. Fear didn't make Eddie strange. Fear made him careful. Mrs. Donnelly drove them toward the edge of town where the streetlights grew sparse and the houses sat farther apart, tucked behind winter trees. A retired mailman's words echoed in Marisol's head, near the old Harlan property, and the thought made her stomach tighten. They passed a long fence and a private road sign, half hidden by branches, the kind of sign that didn't just ask you to keep out, it assumed you would. Marisol imagined Eddie standing near a place like this, watching from shadows, knowing exactly what kind of world lived behind those gates. Mrs. Donnelly didn't speak much. She just kept driving, jaw set with the determination of someone who had decided fear didn't get the final word. When they returned to Marisol's neighborhood, she asked Mrs. Donnelly to slow down near the curb where it had all begun. The street looked ordinary again. Porches dark, decorations drooping, the Happy New Year banner still hanging like a joke that had gone stale. Marisol stepped out and knelt, ignoring the cold soaking into her jeans, searching along the edge of the sidewalk the way someone searches for a lost ring. Her fingers brushed something tucked beneath the concrete lip, paper, folded tight and hidden like a secret that didn't trust daylight. She pulled it free, and her throat tightened before she even opened it. The note was written in rough, uneven handwriting, the letters pressed hard as if the pen had been the only thing keeping the writer steady. It wasn't a plea, and it wasn't an apology. It was instruction, the kind that came from someone who knew time was running out. A simple map was sketched in the corner, leading toward a small park beyond the river, and beneath it were words that made Marisol's chest go cold. Don't trust the ones who smile for cameras. She read it twice, then a third time, feeling the warning settle into her bones. And at the bottom, underlined once, was the name that dried her mouth completely. Harlan, as if fate itself had circled the truth and dared her to look away. Marisol found the park, just as the last light thinned into a pale winter grey, the river nearby whispering under a skin of cold. The gazebo Eddie had chosen sat back from the path, half hidden by bare branches that clicked softly in the wind. Mrs. Donnelly stayed a respectful distance away, as if she understood some truths needed space to breathe. Marisol stepped forward slowly, heart pounding, and spotted him beneath the gazebo roof, hunched, watchful, alive. When Eddie saw her, relief flickered in his eyes for a split second, and then fear swallowed it again. "You shouldn't have come," he said, but his voice shook with something that sounded like gratitude fighting panic. His clothes were the same worn layers, yet there was a dignity in the way he held himself, like a man trying to remember who he used to be. Marisol kept her hands open, palms visible, speaking softly as if sudden movement might break him. "I wasn't going to leave you," she replied, and the words came out steadier than she felt. Eddie glanced past her at Mrs. Donnelly's car, then back to Marisol, as if calculating how many lives his secret could burn. The silence between them stretched, until it felt like a confession waiting for permission. Eddie finally exhaled and looked down at his hands, the way people do when they're about to say something that changes everything. "Eddie isn't my full name," he admitted, voice low, raw with shame. He told her he had once worked inside the Harlan world, not as a charity case, but as someone trusted with sensitive information, someone who handled details powerful people didn't want to touch. There were records, he said, documents that never belonged in the open, decisions made years ago that destroyed lives quietly and legally. Graham Harlan hadn't simply become a billionaire through talent and timing. He had protected an inheritance the way some men protect stolen property, by burying the truth deep enough that nobody would dig. Marisol felt her stomach turn as she realized the curb wasn't the beginning of this story. It was only where it spilled into daylight. Eddie's eyes glistened, but he refused to let tears fall, as if even that would be a weakness someone could use. "I tried to do the right thing," he whispered, and something broke in the edges of his voice. He told her he had attempted to bring the truth to someone who promised protection, someone who smiled for cameras and spoke about integrity, and that was the moment his life collapsed. He lost his job, his name, his home, and then the simple safety of walking down a street without checking over his shoulder. "They didn't just take everything," Eddie said, swallowing hard. "They made it look like I deserved it." Marisol's hands curled into fists at her sides, not in anger at Eddie, but at the cruelty of a world that could erase a man and call it justice. Then Eddie lifted his gaze to hers, and the air seemed to sharpen around the words he was about to say. "Graham isn't hunting me because I stole money," he said, and the calm in his tone scared Marisol more than shouting ever could. "He's hunting me because I know who he really is." The river kept whispering, the branches kept clicking, and somewhere far away a car door slammed, echoing faintly through the park like a warning. Marisol felt the truth settle into her bones, heavy, undeniable, because if Eddie was right, feeding him hadn't just been kindness. It had been the match that lit a secret powerful enough to burn them all. Marisol didn't sleep after the park. Not really, because her mind kept circling Eddie's words like a warning bell that wouldn't stop ringing. By morning, she had made a decision that felt too big for someone who poured coffee for a living. She would not let the truth die in the shadows just because a billionaire wanted it buried. Mrs. Donnelly drove her to a modest legal aid office tucked between a laundromat and a pharmacy, where the walls were lined with flyers about tenant rights and domestic safety. A young attorney listened without interrupting, eyes sharpening when Marisol mentioned Graham Harlan's name and Eddie's fear of being handled. They couldn't promise miracles, but they promised one thing Marisol had been starving for since New Year's: someone would take her seriously. By afternoon, a local journalist agreed to meet them in a small diner booth far from the windows, the kind of place where conversations disappeared into the clatter of dishes. The reporter's pen moved quickly, but his face stayed sober, as if he'd learned that big stories rarely came wrapped in neat certainty. Mrs. Donnelly slid her cracked phone video across the table like a fragile weapon, and Marisol watched the journalist's eyes narrow at the image of the SUV, the security men, the raised palm that stopped kindness like it was trespassing. "This isn't proof of a crime," he admitted, "but it's proof of control." Marisol nodded, because that was exactly what she'd felt. Control pressing down until truth couldn't lift its head. Graham's response came faster than she expected, as if he'd been waiting for her to move so he could show her how small she was. A message arrived through a polished intermediary, an assistant with a smooth voice and a careful choice of words, inviting Marisol to clear up misunderstandings at the Harlan estate. It wasn't a threat on paper. It was an offer dressed in civility, the kind that made refusal feel reckless. Mrs. Donnelly told Marisol not to go, that nothing good happened behind gates built to keep people out, but Marisol felt something stubborn in her spine, the same thing that made her kneel on cold concrete with a warm plate in her hands. If Graham wanted to talk, she wanted to see what he feared enough to chase. The estate looked like a postcard from another universe. Long driveway, iron gates, manicured lawns resting under winter frost like velvet. Inside, the mansion smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive air, as if money could be bottled and sprayed into every corner. Graham greeted her without warmth or hostility, the perfect mask of a man trained to win without appearing to fight. He led her through a hallway lined with framed photos, charity galas, ribbon cuttings, smiles captured mid-laugh, proof that he knew how to look good while deciding who mattered. "You're a hard-working young woman," he said, offering tea she didn't touch, "and you've gotten yourself mixed up in something you don't understand." Then he laid out his offer like a contract. A better job, a scholarship fund, a relocation package, anything that would make her life easier and her silence more comfortable. His voice stayed gentle, almost fatherly, but the numbers he spoke sounded like a price tag on her conscience. Marisol listened, steady, because she understood that intimidation often arrived wearing a smile. When she finally shook her head and said, "No," the room seemed to cool by a degree. Graham's eyes tightened, and for the first time his control slipped just enough for something else to show, fear, sharp and personal, because he wasn't trying to buy her kindness anymore. He was trying to stop what her kindness had started. Marisol left the estate with her spine straight and her stomach tight, the cold air outside feeling cleaner than the polished rooms she'd just walked through. Mrs. Donnelly was waiting at the gate, engine running, eyes scanning the road like she expected trouble to roll up at any moment. Marisol slid into the passenger seat and didn't speak for a long time, because the mansion's silence still clung to her like perfume. When she finally exhaled, it sounded like she'd been holding her breath since New Year's morning. "He offered to fix my life," she murmured, and Mrs. Donnelly answered without hesitation, "No, he offered to buy your quiet." The journalist moved quickly after that, not with loud headlines, but with careful steps that turned whispers into a trail. He verified the SUV's registration through contacts who owed him favors, noted the private security company Graham used, and started asking questions in places where the rich rarely expected to be questioned. The attorney filed quiet requests for protection and documentation, small legal motions that didn't look dramatic but created a paper path that couldn't be erased with charm. Eddie, still hidden, was moved between safe rooms and church basements, always one step away from being found, always one step closer to being believed. Marisol visited him when she could, bringing not food this time, but updates, proof that the truth was starting to breathe. Each time Eddie heard the progress, his shoulders loosened a fraction, like a man remembering what it felt like to stand without flinching. And then the first shift happened in town, the kind of change you could feel before you could measure it. People who once spoke Graham Harlan's name like it was a blessing began to say it more carefully, like a question. A friend of the journalist's published a short piece about a powerful local figure and an alleged effort to silence a vulnerable man, leaving names out but lighting a spark anyway. At the diner, two customers argued softly about whether billionaires were always philanthropists or if philanthropy was sometimes just a curtain. Marisol kept her head down and poured coffee, but she could feel eyes on her now. Not admiring, not cruel, just curious, because people sensed a story under the surface. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt exposed. Graham didn't react with a tantrum. He reacted with strategy. He released photos of himself donating winter coats, smiling beside cameras, hands resting gently on shoulders as if he had invented compassion. He sent polite messages through assistants, suggesting Marisol was confused and Eddie was unstable, planting the idea that the truth was just a misunderstanding in need of correction. Yet behind the polished performance, Marisol saw what he couldn't hide: urgency. His offers grew sharper, his patience thinner, his control less effortless than before. Power, she realized, looked calm until it started losing. Then came the request that changed the air entirely. Through the attorney, Graham asked for a private meeting with Eddie, no press, no court, no audience, just the two of them, to resolve this humanely. Eddie's face went pale when Marisol told him, and he stared at the floor as if he could see the past waiting there. Mrs. Donnelly called it a trap, the journalist called it a play, and the attorney warned that private was where truth went to disappear. But Eddie's hands trembled in a different way now, less like fear, more like a painful readiness. "Maybe this is the only way," he whispered, and Marisol felt her heart sink with the weight of that sentence, because she couldn't tell if Graham's request was repentance or the last, most dangerous attempt at control. They chose the church meeting room because it belonged to no one, and because even the powerful tended to lower their voices near stained glass. The space was plain: folding chairs, a long table, a pitcher of water that looked almost ceremonial in its simplicity. Mrs. Donnelly waited in the hallway with the attorney, close enough to help, but far enough to let the moment stay honest. Marisol sat near the door, hands clasped, feeling the strange weight of being present for something bigger than her own life. When Eddie walked in, he moved slowly, but he walked upright, as if he had decided fear would not be his posture anymore. Graham arrived without his security team, and the absence of them felt louder than their presence ever had. His suit was still perfect, his hair still neat, yet something in his face looked different, tired around the eyes, like the mask had begun to chafe. He didn't smile for cameras because there were none, and without that audience, his confidence seemed less polished. Eddie didn't offer a hand, and Graham didn't demand one. For a long second, they simply looked at each other, two men shaped by different kinds of hunger, one for safety, one for control. Marisol felt her throat tighten because she understood that this wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning. Eddie spoke first, voice low but steady, and he didn't start with anger. "I'm not here to destroy you," he said, and the calmness in that sentence carried more strength than shouting ever could. He described what had been taken, his job, his name, his ability to sleep without waking in panic, yet he framed it as truth, not revenge. "You didn't only ruin my life," Eddie added, eyes wet but unblinking. "You made it look like I deserved it." Graham's jaw clenched, and for the first time Marisol saw him as something other than a symbol, just a man trying not to drown in what he had protected. The room stayed still, as if the walls themselves were listening. When Graham finally spoke, his voice trembled in a way Marisol hadn't expected, as if the words were heavier than money. He admitted what he could no longer deny, that he had been terrified of losing everything, and he had convinced himself that fear justified whatever he did to keep it. "I told myself it was business," he said quietly, "that it was necessary, that it wasn't personal." Eddie's expression didn't soften, but it shifted, because he had waited a long time just to hear the truth said out loud. Marisol watched and learned something she had never been taught in school or work. Healing wasn't soft, it was brave, and it required people to sit inside discomfort without running. In that moment, Graham looked less like a victor and more like someone finally cornered by his own conscience. Graham offered restitution, public correction, a formal statement, funding for transparent programs that didn't hide behind his name. Yet Eddie didn't nod or thank him. He stared at the table, as if measuring the distance between apology and repair, between words and the years stolen from him. "Forgiveness isn't a switch," Eddie said, voice breaking slightly, and Marisol felt tears sting her eyes at the simple honesty of it. Graham swallowed hard, waiting, and the silence stretched until it felt like the whole room was holding its breath. Then Eddie lifted his gaze and said the sentence that made Marisol's heart stop in her chest. "I will forgive you, if you do one thing first." Eddie's condition was simple, but it carried the weight of every night he had slept with one ear open, and every morning he had woken up feeling hunted. He looked Graham straight in the eye and said, "Tell the truth in front of everyone, without hiding behind lawyers, without charity photos, without turning it into a misunderstanding." The church room fell so quiet, Marisol could hear the faint hum of the heater, steady and indifferent to human courage. Graham's throat tightened, as if the words had to pass through something heavy inside him. "You want me to confess," he said, voice low, and Eddie nodded once, unwavering. "Not for me," Eddie answered, "for the people you erased before me." Graham didn't answer right away, but his posture shifted, his shoulders lowering slightly, as if the fight was finally draining out of him. "If I do that," he murmured, "I lose the story I've been living in." Eddie's eyes softened, not with pity, but with the recognition of someone who understood what it meant to lose your life and still keep your soul. Marisol watched Graham's hands and saw they weren't as still as they used to be, the tremor of a man learning he couldn't buy his way out of the moment. "Then lose it," Eddie said quietly, "and build a better one." For the first time, Graham looked less like a legend and more like a person standing at the edge of his own conscience. The truth didn't explode with fireworks. It arrived the way truth often does, plain, steady, and impossible to ignore once spoken. Days later, Graham stood before a community gathering where the cameras weren't his friends and the questions weren't rehearsed. He admitted what he had done, named the intimidation for what it was, and acknowledged decisions that had protected his inheritance at the cost of human lives. The journalist published the story with timelines and documents, and the town read it the way people watch a storm pass, stunned, shaken, and quietly relieved that the sky had finally cleared. Eddie was offered protection and real medical care, not as a symbol, but as a man whose dignity had been stolen and deserved to be returned. Marisol went back to the diner and poured coffee with steadier hands, because at last the truth wasn't something she carried alone. Weeks passed, and the curb where it all began looked different, not because it became famous, but because it became cared for. A small outreach partnership formed between shelters, churches and volunteers, funded transparently with oversight that didn't allow generosity to become control. Mrs. Donnelly kept showing up like a guardian angel in sensible shoes, pushing Marisol toward night classes and reminding her that courage should grow into a future, not just survive a crisis. Eddie began volunteering in a shelter kitchen, and the first time Marisol saw him handing out warm plates with calm eyes and a clean sweater, her throat tightened with a grateful ache. Graham's life didn't reset with a ribbon cutting. It changed through slow restitution, quiet meetings, public accountability, and the uncomfortable work of listening without defending himself. And the town, after seeing how easily it had looked away, began to look twice at the people it once stepped around. On the next New Year's morning, the air was cold again, and the sky was pale again, but something in Marisol felt warmer than before. She stood in the shelter kitchen holding a plate, watching steam rise like a small blessing, and understood a truth that didn't need applause. Kindness isn't small when it refuses to be silenced. Eddie met her eyes and smiled, not with gratitude that felt like debt, but with peace that felt earned. Mrs. Donnelly squeezed Marisol's shoulder in passing, the gesture so ordinary it felt sacred, and Marisol realized this was what redemption looked like. Quiet people choosing to see one another. Happy New Year, and may this year bring you more kindness than you expect, and more courage than you think you have. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. Your message might be the kindness someone else needed today.